UPC or supporting UPC, please reach out. You can contact us in the gifted department. You can go to gifted at PVUPC.org. I always get it wrong. I always flip it around. So please, if you are interested in getting involved, we would love to have you support us. I'm going to turn it over to you ladies because they're not here to listen to me. They are here to listen to you. So thank you so much.
Welcome everyone to our presentation of No, It Isn't Too Early. Challenges and opportunities with young gifted learners. And we'll talk about the reason for that title in a moment. I'm Dr. Laura Wingers, the founder and a licensed clinical psychologist at Center Psychology and Consulting, located in Phoenix. And with me today is my warm and wonderful colleague, Dr. Beth Richter, who is also a licensed clinical psychologist at Center, where we serve children and families, preschool through high school, and with a range of services and needs. So let me start by saying, when we think of gifted learners, people who are unfamiliar with this population often think immediately of the child's intellect, right? Or they think of their academic achievement. We will hear words like, oh, this child's precocious, or is this child a prodigy? And so, of course, there can be a lot of misinformation and misconceptions about this group of individuals, including the when and the why to identify gifted potential. There's so much more to gifted learners than their intellect and achievements, as I know most of you in this audience probably know quite well. And there's challenges and opportunities that come along with that. So you want to share what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so we have a lot of good information that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about that identification gap. What is that and why is it important? We're also going to talk about the developmental timeline of key skills and strategies and supports for the whole child approach to early years, because as you were saying, I think what we run into a lot is we're focused on intellect and achievement, and there's so much more to a kiddo than the intellect and achievement, and there's so much more that goes with giftedness. And so we really like to take at Center a whole child approach. And then we're going to be talking about differential diagnoses, the difference between asynchronous development and twice exceptionality, executive function challenges that often go along with things like ADHD, and some other neurodevelopmental disorders like autism. We'll also touch on learning differences, specifically stealth dyslexia, because that's something that's not often talked about and I think really important to touch on. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you, how did you get into this passion population of yours?
Yeah, well, I think that I got into it when I learned the answer to this question, and I'll throw this out to our audience. Let me ask you if you know the answer to this. When do you think parents typically can recognize signs of giftedness? Is it as early as infancy, age 3, age 7, age 10? Okay, we got some for 3, some for 7. Yeah, fantastic. Well, turns out the answer, according to my research, is actually age 3. And that really made me think, wow, when do kids get identified? When's it typically identified? Age 7, or even as late as age 9. So I got really interested and really curious about what happens in those years between 3 and 7, 3 and 9. And what we really found is that there's a lot of challenges that can arise when those gifted traits are not well understood. I lived this. If you had asked me 20 years ago, what was it? I think it's important to identify giftedness early. I would have said no, because I think I held a lot of those same misconceptions and had some of that same misinformation. Those kids are fine. What's the hurry? Let them be kids. We don't need to worry about, right? So that I had that same misconception. And so it was really through my own journey as a parent of gifted children, as well as my work with this population, where I really began to recognize all the nuances, all the things that are tremendous and wonderful, and that we can do so much to enhance and enrich and make a joyful journey. But also the other side of it, which is that sometimes there's some intensity, some other issues that go along with that way of being, that if they're not well understood, can be overly pathologized or really head us in the wrong direction.
Definitely, I agree. And let's go back to that question of what happens between 3 and 7 and 3 and 9. And the research is really interesting. There's a lot of critical skill development during that time, and not just in the cognitive domain, but in the social domain as well as the emotional domain. And those 3 areas impact everything that we do in life. And so we want to talk about cognitive real quick. So do you want to talk about what you think of when you think of cognitive?
Yeah, and I'm sure you've got it up here.
Yeah.
You know, when I think of the development of cognitive skills in early childhood and in those early elementary years, I'm not just talking about intellect. Now, of course, we can try to measure intellect in those early years. That's a misconception a lot of times, that we can't do that, but we can do that quite young based on some normative samples. That's just a developmental snapshot in time. It's not set in stone, but it is some measure, some indication of a child's potential, but it's not measured in the same way as it might be at age 10, for example. On the other hand, beyond just the cognitive piece, the intellectual piece, there's also these other cognitive skills, what we call executive function skills. And I imagine some of you in the audience are familiar with the idea of executive function skills. I mean, things like working memory. For example, working memory is that ability to just hold information in mind temporarily and use that for some purpose for problem solving, right? It's a skill that doesn't often even begin to develop until around age 4 or 5. But if you've got some difficulties in that area, you can often be seen as a child who is unmotivated or distractible or not capable, when in fact it's a developmental issue. Along with that executive function, there's others like impulse control, what we call inhibitory control, the ability to stop and think. When you're 4, can you stop and think as easily as you can when you're 9 or 10? Probably not. So again, understanding that, attentional control, flexibility, the ability to take others' perspectives. These are really critical skills that are developing during that period of time. And depending on what type of an environment we're in, what type of skills we're teaching, we can make those stronger. You talk about some of these skills as being like a muscle.
Yeah.
We can make these stronger.
Absolutely. And I think within the cognitive domain as well, we want to think about beliefs and attitudes. So beliefs and attitudes really guide our own sense of self and how we approach learning, right? And so these beliefs and attitudes can go in multiple different directions, but think about growth mindset versus fixed mindset, right? So growth mindset, you praise the process and over the outcome, whereas the fixed mindset, you're a little bit more rigid and you care more about that outcome. And this comes from the research of Carol Dweck. And this is huge for our gifted learners because we often see those perfectionistic tendencies, right? And that rigid thinking that can lead to more of a fixed mindset, which can then impact your overall emotional well-being, right?
Of course. And if that's the lens through which you're viewing the world, of course, you're going to have trouble managing your emotions.
Yeah.
One of the key things we see in that asynchrony and development in young gifted kids can be this intense difficulty tolerating frustration. So how do we manage that intense feeling? How do we manage the associated behaviors that come along with that? How do we understand others' perspectives? When we got a really clear idea in our own mind of how things should be or how I want this to be, how can it kind of take the perspective of others? This is another area that gifted kids can get into some trouble.
Definitely. And that's related, if we kind of link it back to the cognitive skills, that's related to cognitive flexibility, right? The ability to perspective take that really impacts that emotional piece. And then it impacts the social piece, right? The perspective taking. If you can't perspective take, or you see it one way and you're really stuck on seeing it that way, how are you going to engage socially? Or maybe you have a very strict rule of fairness and what's just in this world, which we know for our gifted individuals is really, really prominent. I see some head nods there. Yeah. And so how are we then interacting with our peers who may not see it that way, right? So these are really, really critical skills that are developing. But I think something that's interesting that I didn't know initially, that I started diving into the research a little bit more, is the physiological changes. Now, if you look on your left, you'll see at birth, those neuronal connections. That's what you're looking at, the neurons in your brain and the different connections. That's at birth. Check out 15 months. Holy moly, Rocky, right? And the same is going when you think about these kids from 3 to 7 to 9, right? And for our gifted kids, there's some evidence in the newer research that these individuals actually have earlier and more prolonged development of their cortex. So this means that it starts earlier and it's going for a longer amount of time, which can really contribute to that asynchronous, right?
Yeah, so again, if we think of this critical skills and some critical periods for development, I think that really lends itself to the argument that there's a need for early identification and early intervention if there's some difficulties as well.
Definitely. So,
but before we go any further, maybe we should stop and talk a little bit about, let's stop and think, how do we define giftedness? Anybody want to hazard a guess? I find it interesting. I think if I asked each of you, you probably have a slightly different answer. If we're looking strictly at criteria for eligibility for services in the schools, well, that's governed by some federal guidelines, state laws, local guidelines, individual districts, and how they interpret and respond, and what those programming options and those identification options look like. But if I look at giftedness as a broader construct, including creative abilities or other abilities that are less quantifiable, that's another thing. I think it's also important to take into consideration cultural context, and what is appropriate and what is accepted in different cultures may look very different than what that norm is. A related question to this idea of how do we define giftedness is, does every gifted child experience asynchronous development? Do you think anybody really understands asynchronous development?
I really don't. I feel like a lot of the times it's thrown out there, and even in our own field, sometimes I feel like this concept gets thrown around a little bit. So when you posed that question, I was like, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And, when I was doing my research in my dissertation on gifted help seeking and parents help seeking in the gifted identification process, we really tried to define some of that, because what we found in that research was that, 85% of the folks who were seeking identification in the early years for their gifted child were there because of school placement issues. But what was a more surprising finding was that almost 70% of those individuals also had some social, emotional, or behavioral concerns about their child. And so this idea of asynchrony is, number one, asynchrony is a normal part of child development. Not every gifted child, every child, gifted or not, experiences asynchrony. If you're a parent, you recognize, of course, there were some differences in when your child learned to walk or talk or began to engage in different ways compared to others that you know. I think what matters with gifted children is that those differences can be more pronounced. Yeah, there can be really much greater variability in intellectual development as compared to emotional maturity, behavioral intensity, the development of academic skills, and so on.
And that can be really confusing, I think, for parents and for educators. When I think about parents coming in and talking about, my kid can talk to me about all of these incredible things, but I tell him that he needs to go brush his teeth and put his pajamas on, and it's like the world has fallen apart and he doesn't know what's happening. And it's so confusing. And I get that. I get that even in our room sometimes when you're working with a kid, you're like, wow, you can understand this complex topic, but socially and emotionally, are you able to reason with that information? That's two different questions.
And these skills don't conform, right, to the bell curve. It's not always a useful construct. And so as we move forward in this conversation, and we're going to talk more about some of the descriptors of high potential in gifted kids, you will recognize that we're not talking about intellect, and we're not talking about academic achievement necessarily, at least in this portion of our presentation, because we really want you to understand some of the other ways of being. So as we talk about some of these descriptors in this next slide, before we change there, I'd like you to anchor yourself. Stop and think about your child. Stop and think about why you're here, why you're listening to this presentation. Or think about a child in your classroom. All right, and as we talk about these descriptors, see if you can identify with some of them.
So I'm gonna actually make this interactive, and I really would like to invite you guys to raise your hand. So raise your hand if this individual that you're thinking of engages in self-critical behaviors and or perfectionistic tendencies. Yeah. What about the early use of advanced vocabulary? What about early literacy skills? Okay. Excellent memory. Oh, good. Curiosity and inquisitiveness. The a million questions that never end. Yes.
It's exhausting.
It's exhausting. Intense interest in specific topics. Yeah. What about strong critical thinking and negotiation skills? Yeah, we've got some negotiators in the building. And then creativity and imagination. Yeah. Yep. Ability to understand complex concepts. Yeah, yeah. And then early demonstration of talents in music, art, athletics, or performing arts. Yes, 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 yes. So what I love about all of this is you can all identify with some aspect of this. So we've identified, we know a gifted kid. Okay, what do we do?
Yeah.
What's the next step?
I'll tell you, one of the things that I found is almost the most common question that gets asked when people come to us with their gifted child is, what do I do so I don't screw this up? Right? Because you have this sense of responsibility as a parent that you want to do right by your child. That's it. We all just want to do right by our child. And we want to make sure that we're making good decisions for them in all areas of their life. And 20 years into my career, I just want to say that this whole child approach, I think, is just so critical. It's easy to get caught up in comparison, or I should be doing this, or I shouldn't be doing that. But honestly, you are enough as a parent. And I think you sometimes have to back away from some of that. So these ideas of, the high potential, we saw you chuckle and smile as you thought about some of this, but there's some associated challenges as well, right? If you've got a child who is this self-critical, that can be leading us into some anxiety. If you have a child who is having early literacy skills, you're just trying to feed that brain and you're trying to find the right school placement. If you've got a child who's so curious and creative, you want to find ways to meet those needs as well. But as we said, this doesn't always conform to adulthood. Yeah. And so we need to think about that first and primary question that parents ask, which is, what's the appropriate school placement for our gifted learner? Some of this is beyond the scope of the time we have. And again, if you're here, you probably have a child who's in a gifted program. So I'm not going to belabor the point other than to say that there are these school placement options that vary according to a child's eligibility based on testing. If you have questions about the testing process, I encourage you to reach out to your district, go onto the website, and they'll get to you all the information about the testing that's done in the schools, the times of year that that's done, as well as private testing and what that can look like. Once you know that information, then we can start talking about levels of giftedness and levels of need. There are some things like acceleration programs. There are enrichment models. There is a self-contained or comprehensive gifted pathway. There's a gifted cluster pathway. And in some districts, there's magnet schools, STEM academies, for example. If you have a child who's got a diagnosis of ADHD or dyslexia or autism spectrum that is significantly impacting their progression, they might need a uniquely gifted program, 2E program, right? There's also questions about, does my child need to accelerate? Is this the right time? If they're 5 years old, do I really need to, be pushing really for that acceleration model? It's not, it might be absolutely the right thing for some of these children and absolutely not the right thing for others. So it isn't just based on a number. It isn't just based on a score. And any decision like this is entered into thoughtfully based on talking with the professionals that know your child and looking at all your options.
Definitely think of goodness of fit, right? Like what is the right match for your kiddo, which is a big piece of the puzzle. But outside of school, there's other things we can do too. Enrichment doesn't just have to happen within the school setting. So some of the things I think about are extracurriculars. And extracurriculars are huge because I think about the social aspect, right? Like how do we learn how to navigate a team and how can that impact our ability to navigate different situations with our peers, right? And then I think about a mentor. I think a mentor is such a unique thing that we can give to a kiddo at a young age because oftentimes kids don't have that mentor, right? And this doesn't have to be like a professor from such and such. It can be your neighbor. It can be your grandma. It can be a coach. I love when I see a coach mentor a kiddo because you know what? That's where growth mindset happens, right? Here are all of the mistakes that I made along the way, and man, am I proud of them because I wouldn't be able to be here with you today if I didn't make those mistakes. Wow, like what a message to a kid,
Yeah. So everybody who's part of this talk today has probably had to start making these kinds of decisions. You've started to make decisions about what is the appropriate placement for your child, how to provide some enrichment for them, what that pathway looks like. But I want to, again, slow us down, think about that whole child piece and say, please beware of that never enough achievement culture. There is a very recent book, it just came out in 2023, by Jennifer Breheny Wallace, who wrote a book called Never Enough, When Achievement Culture Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It. She surveyed folks across the nation, and she wrote here, this is an excerpt from an article in the New York Times. It said, kids are absorbing the idea that their worth is contingent on their performance, that not on who they are deep at their core. And over half the students that she surveyed went so far as to say they thought their parents loved them more when they were more successful. With 25% of students saying they believe this a lot. Let that sink in, right? No one intends for that to happen. But what messages are we sending, or our culture sending, that is putting that out there, that my worth, my value is somehow based on my achievement? That's just wrong. Angela Duckworth, who's another great source if you want to learn more about the idea of mindset and grit. She wrote that recently a 16-year-old high school student asked her, is achievement the same as success? And her answer is, boy, if achievement is all you're chasing, it will never be enough. It'll never be enough. So, but if you matter to your family, you matter to your friends, if you're important to your community and you give back in some way to your community, you'll always feel like a success, right? So I needed to drop that in there because, again, I really think that we have to sometimes step back from the comparison and the pressure to go quickly into accelerating for our gifted children when we really need them to have the time and space to develop in other ways.
Yeah, and that goes back to our research on overall mental well-being, right? When you think about does achievement and success in that way equal mental health, being healthy, right? And the reality is, and what we see in the research is, no, it's about social connection, about meaningful relationships. It's about what your values are. Who are you at your core? If we can teach that to our kiddos, forget like just that kiddo and what's going to happen. I mean, if we did that as a society, what a beautiful message we could have.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that the key is at any age that we're really trying to keep stress at tolerable levels, not toxic levels. And you mentioned earlier, the newest research on growth mindset is not just praising the process, not the outcome, but actually talking about the fact that stress is a good thing. A certain amount of, moderate level of stress is a good thing. So think about your gifted child. You were anchoring yourself in some of these ideas. You're thinking about those qualities that have been wonderful to observe, but maybe also difficult to observe. Part of that is teaching them that it is okay to be stressed. It is okay to fail. Failure can be a great way to learn. And again, that's a hard lesson to learn. It's hard for any of us at any stage of life, but I think it's really important that we recognize that. So as we think about ways to keep stress tolerable, not toxic, I know we really wanted to give you all some actionable steps, some things you can actually do at home with kids to promote this way of being. You want to take some of that?
Yeah. And I do want to mention, thinking about stress, think about stress as a spice level in a recipe. And this is a good analogy to explain to your kids too. If you have a little bit of spice, kind of kicks it up a notch. Your taste buds are a little happy with that. But if you like put a bunch of serranos and ghost peppers into your guacamole, we're going to have a problem, right? Like we're not going to enjoy it as much. Same goes with stress. When you have a little bit of stress, you get kind of excited. It gets you going, right? But if you have a lot of it and it's too much and it becomes toxic, it actually can have a negative physiological effect, much like that stuff. So let's talk about the first step in making stress tolerable and not toxic. And this comes from the research on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the leading treatment for mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression. Okay. And the research is really clear on this, and it sounds almost too simple. But if we can label our emotions, if we know what we are experiencing, then we can improve our overall mental health outcomes long term. And we like to get as specific as possible because that's what the research says is beneficial. Get as specific as you can. I don't know if who's familiar with Brene Brown? Anybody in here? Yeah. So she did Atlas of the Heart recently. And it's a book of all of these emotions. And she also did an HBO special. You can watch that as well. What I loved about that is it got really nuanced and specific in how we describe our emotions.
I love that because I think of what young gifted kids, though often they can, many of them can identify that I'm happy or I'm angry or I'm sad or I'm scared. But it's really the research is indicating that as you get into the more specific, more nuanced ways of thinking about yourself, that you are better able to respond, better able to cope.
Exactly, because you understand it. Going back to your point earlier, you talked about if we can understand something, we can respond differently. It feels more controllable and tolerable. Same thing goes with emotions. If we understand what we're experiencing, it becomes more tolerable. So finding like a wheel like this and putting it on your refrigerator and doing a daily check-in. Maybe it's at the dinner table. Maybe it's before you go to bed. And try to get specific because I don't know about you, but so many kids are like, I'm fine. And you know what? I'm guilty of it. I think we did this earlier today. I'm fine. Everything's fine, right? But like really, what are you experiencing in your mind and your body? It's so critical. So what's step number 2 when we think about cognitive behavioral therapy? Well, the question is, where do emotions come from?
Yeah, where do emotions come from? What triggers emotions?
Yeah, and I think oftentimes people are like, well, this thing happened and now I feel this way, right? So we attribute our emotions to a particular situation, but we're missing a step right in between. It's actually the story that we tell ourselves about the situation that makes us feel a certain way. So you can have the exact same situation, 2 different thoughts about what happened and totally different emotions.
Right. I will sometimes use it just with young kids. Of course, some of this is very cognitive, right? And not every child is capable of understanding this. But even at a very simple, basic level, sometimes they say, think about walking down the hallway and somebody kind of bumps into you and knocks your books out of your hand. You can have a thought about that, like, that person totally did that on purpose and they're so mean and I'm so angry and right, and you have a
Mhm.
certain reaction to that.
Yeah.
Versus having a different thought about that, which is maybe they were distracted, maybe they didn't see that they did that. I'm sure they didn't do that on purpose.
Yeah.
And what your reaction, your emotion is, and therefore your response to that situation.
Definitely. I think that's critical. And especially when you think about gifted kids, over here we have what we call thinking thinking or cognitive distortion. The research says, I think a study came out saying about 40% of individuals, of thoughts that go through individuals' minds who are not diagnosed with a mental health disorder, for all intents and purposes, are mentally healthy or have health and well-being, 40% of their thoughts are considered negative. Okay, so 40% of our thoughts are considered negative. If we fuse ourselves with those thoughts, if we believe every thought that goes through our mind, that's a lot of negative. That's only 60-40, right? It's not good odds, right? And so we want to be aware of these things because gifted kids, that black and white thinking happens all the time. It's either this or it's that. There's nothing in between. This is another refrigerator sheet. Put it on your refrigerator and model it. Do it for yourself first, because I'm telling you, it's a little bit more challenging than it looks initially. Like when I started doing this work, I'm like, I don't know, I'm having thought and I'm feeling this way, right? But we really have to start examining and doing it ourselves, because if we can't model that for ourselves, it's really hard for our kids to kind of jump on board and have buy-in. Okay, now we've identified the thoughts. So what, right? Oftentimes they're like, cool, Dr. Richter, I don't care. Now what do I do, right? But this is the fun stuff. We get to examine our thoughts and we get to be critical of our thoughts. The first question I always ask kids is this thought helpful? Is it helping you? No? Cool. Then we say, bye, Felicia, and we move on. And then they usually laugh at me and giggle and say, oh, you're so silly. But truly, I'm separating who they are and externalizing a thought. And then these are all what we call Socratic questions. This is how we examine a thought. This is how we challenge a thought so that we're no longer fused with it, because we are not our thoughts, right? Thoughts go through our mind all the time. Like I'm thinking of a pink elephant. There's no pink elephant, but that's what I'm thinking about, right? So if we have the power to change our thoughts, we have the power to change how we're feeling. And that is a pretty powerful message to give to a kiddo.
And what I love about that is that's true no matter what your circumstances. Right now, sometimes you are just going through it. Yep. I'm going through it. And when you're just going through it, sometimes you just have to keep going.
Yep.
But you can still choose your response. The same is true if you've got a kid who has a neurodevelopmental issue or a learning challenge or is really struggling with anxiety. We can't immediately change that fact, but we can change how we respond to it, and we can change how our child sees it in response to difficulties that arise for them as well.
Yes, even the act of externalizing those thoughts and externalizing, separating yourself from those thoughts, that in and of itself in the research is extremely beneficial.
Who gets hijacked by their thoughts? Raise your hand if you get hijacked. Yeah,
Right.
Every one of us does. And
Yeah.
again, there's some good evidence about why that is. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to try to get out of that in yet another way, because we've just discussed some things that are very cognitive, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of language here. There's a lot of abstraction, and not everybody is developmentally ready for that.
And you don't want to try it in the middle of a meltdown. So like if your kid is kind of having a meltdown, we're not going to be like, your feeling is what, right? Like we might label the feeling for them. You're feeling really frustrated right now, but we're not going to try to examine their thoughts, because the part of their brain that does that is offline. It's bye-bye, right? Downstairs brain where all the emotions are held is taking over. And at that moment, we just need to get back into our bodies before we can go back and do the cognitive stuff, which reminds me.
Yeah, which brings us to talking a bit about mindfulness. For those of you who know me, you know that this has been an area that I've been interested in, and I teach and practice with students, with teachers, and of course for myself for a long time. mindfulness, the idea that we have to simply, I don't know, be present in the moment without judgment, but rather with just accepting what's unfolding moment to moment. I'll say that again. The idea for the definition for me of mindfulness is just being present in the moment without judgment, but rather with accepting what's happening. When you can simply be present for yourself, for your child, you are much more likely to be responsive and proactive than to be reactive mode, number one, right? It deepens the connection. It deepens your parenting satisfaction. Again, helps you keep stress in a tolerable zone versus going into that toxic zone. And I really love this quote by John Kabat-Zinn. For those of you who aren't familiar, he's a well-known researcher in the area of mindfulness. And he talks about the fact that our experience of the present moment is often distorted through the routine, habitual, and unexamined activity of our thoughts and emotions, often involving significant alienation from direct experience of the sensory world in the body. Boy, is that true for so many of us, right? And so one of the things that we often will explain with parents when they're going through a difficult time with their child is stop responding from the neck up, because we are by nature logical beings. We often really want to use language and explain. And if I can just explain this to you well enough, I'm going to change your response and your reaction. But as you said, if your child is in a more dysregulated state, or they're not developmentally ready yet for that kind of messaging, you really got to go back into their experience of the body and into their experience of sensory regulation tools, which I love. I love I love kids preschool through high school, do not get me wrong, but I really love the sweet spot of 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds. I think they're just such a joy. And so you can really teach them some things, including mindfulness practices at a really early age. If you're interested in learning about this, there's a great organization called Mindful Schools, mindfulschools.org. And just even on their website, there's some really good information, including some sample lessons and some simple videos. Of course, you can go to YouTube now and you find all kinds of things, find something that really resonates with you and for your child. Practicing mindfulness should never be let's do this because it's good for us, eat your vegetables kind of a thing. It should be something that you, again, just get curious about, enjoy exploring. And if your child doesn't want to engage with it, don't force it, but you can still do it for yourself. When I was early in my practice as a young mother, I thought, boy, the research tells me this is great. I'm gonna get my kids to do this with me too. Well, obviously that backfired. But you know what didn't backfire is I just still did it for myself. And what I saw years later is them really taking that modeling and using it for themselves and coming to it in their own time and in their own way. So I really encourage parents to think about some of those sensory regulation tools. It can be something as simple as a 30-second or 1 minute long meditation that you do together to connect. It can be longer things that are really involved in noticing the feelings in your body, noticing your environment, and so on. I know you really like the work of Dr. Becky Kennedy and her book, Good Inside, talking about the idea of deeply feeling children.
Yeah, is anybody familiar with Becky Kennedy? Yeah. So if you aren't, I really would encourage to look her up. She's on Instagram. She's on a bunch of stuff. But what I like about her concept is she believes that every child is inherently good inside, right? And what I like about deeply feeling kids is I really see the gifted child in these deeply feeling kids, because most gifted kiddos, they have big feelings, like very big feelings. And it feels, as much as it feels as the adult in the room with the deeply feeling kid, I can only imagine what that feels like in a tiny body when you are totally out of control. And so she talks a lot about how you can respond to that. I've worked with a lot of gifted kiddos in that 4, 5, 6 range. And we'll do like 3 sessions of just how do we get in touch with sensory stuff. And we will smell things. We will go in nature and feel things. And we'll start getting involved in our bodies. We'll do yoga. We will shred newspaper, which is extremely fun and satisfying. We will get bubble wrap, and then we create, okay, what's out of all the things we've done, what helps you the most? What do you like the most? And then we put that in a little box. And that's their stuff. When they're feeling really dysregulated, that's what they can use. And I really love seeing kids kind of taking, even at that age, their own autonomy of like, I really like smelling the smelly crayons, not too long, but smelling them just long enough, you know? So, yeah.
Creating that safe space, creating that calm down corner or a menu of options that you can choose from. And I don't mean a formal thing, but something that you can rely on so that you're not scrambling in the moment to respond, right?
And if you are scrambling, my favorite thing, give them a piece of paper and say, give them a marker. Say, I want you to show me how angry are you feeling right now, and just let them have at it. And man, those are some neat drawings that I get. Usually it's just a lot of scribbles, but you're getting that physicality out, and that can allow that upstairs brain to come on. Mindfulness, I also wanted to mention Netflix has a couple series, Headspace. So you can watch that as a family. It is family friendly, and I've seen some good feedback on that. So, all right, here we are. We're doing it. We're trying it all. What's next? We've improved sleep, diet, and exercise. We didn't talk about that today, but those are critical things that, of course, anybody wants to address and think about, but we're doing the thing.
And if you come to see us, that is the first thing we're going to talk
Yeah.
about, right? Really, at a foundational level.
Yeah.
We know how critical sleep is
Yeah.
to the brain. We know how critical the right type of nutrition is to the brain. We know a lot more about the gut microbiome and that influence on mood and behavior. The research in that area has exploded in the last 10 years, and we really want to be on the cutting edge of that.
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent in integrative approaches to children's mental health and development. And so if we really kind of look at some foundational things around sleep, diet, and exercise, those small changes can go really, quite honestly, a really long way.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've been trying it all. We have this intense child, whatever that means to you. We're working on those foundational skills. We're trying to find the right balance between the enrichment and the academic placement that's appropriate, and just rest and downtime when nothing is expected and we're not scheduled. We have been trying to teach and practice some of these skills at home. Again, those small changes really can go a long way. But what if they're not enough?
Yeah, so what next? And I think that's when we have to think about more of a collaborative approach, looking at what are the resources and supports that you have in your community for the next step.
Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of times, and again, my research on parents help seeking, we talked about formal pathways and informal pathways. Where do parents go first? Informal pathways. You talk to your other family members, you talk to your friends, you talk to your neighbors, you talk to someone else at your child's school. Those are informal sources of support, are actually quite important. Find out what they know, but it's an opinion, right? It's one person's experience, it's one person's opinion. That doesn't mean it's fact, it doesn't mean it's true or will be true for your child. So take that information in. If you go the more formal route, start by talking with your child's teacher. Your child spends a lot of time with their teacher. These teachers are experts in their area. They will be able to give you a lot of insight into what's going on at school, how that might be addressed as well. Talk to the gifted specialists, talk to other district support staff. Again, each school has quite a number of folks that can support that. If that's not enough, or we don't have challenges at school, Dr. Wingers, our challenges are at home, then we might be having a different kind of conversation. So maybe you're talking to your pediatrician, you're trying to share what those concerns are. Gosh, I suspect my child might have ADHD. Well, let me stop and caution about that for a minute, because I saw a study from the CDC that what percentage of children diagnosed with ADHD also have some other mental health or medical diagnosis? The answer was 60%, 60. So 60% of kids who are being diagnosed with ADHD either have something else altogether or have multiple things going on. But so many of those individuals, about half of kids diagnosed with ADHD, are treated in a primary care setting only. What are the tools available in a primary care setting are more limited in their options. So what we hope will happen is that folks will seek support from other specialists. Do I need to see a speech language pathologist? Are there some concerns around my child's language development, academic development, maybe the social pragmatic language development? We can address that. That's important to do early. Occupational therapy, sensory concerns at an early age. We can really change the trajectory there. Ultimately, maybe you do need to talk with a prescriber, or you're talking with others who provide alternative services. And there's so many people, you guys, executive function coaches, and so many other areas of behavioral supports and therapies that can really turn the dial. So again, with gifted children, it is sometimes more subtle. You might go through a school evaluation, or you might look at a checklist and you're just going to say, my child doesn't quite meet that, but I have to trust my gut. I'm their parent. Something's going on here. I'm concerned. So what do we do about that? Where do we go? That collaborative approach, I think, is really important. You've had some great experiences collaborating with some of the other allied professionals that we work with.
Occupational therapists are game changers because sensory integration is huge. And what I mean by that is think about like sensory, raise your hand if your kiddo has sensory sensitivities of some sort. Yeah. And so what that causes in the body is dysregulation just naturally. And so you're going to have this natural feeling of unrest more frequently. And OTs are amazing at doing sensory integration tasks. There's also a lot of research on executive function skills and motor and the connection there, and they do great work with that. So I've really enjoyed my work with occupational therapists and then speech language pathologists as well. I swear 3 times this week, I called the speech language pathologist to be like, hey, I'm seeing this. What do you think? Because it's important to know, I know what I know, but I don't know it all. They have other pieces of the puzzle. My hope is to connect all the pieces of the puzzle so that I can come back to the parent and say, we've put these pieces together and I think this could be the next step. But we need to rely on that collaborative approach, because if we do it in a silo, we're just not going to be able to meet the need appropriately, especially when it comes to our gifted kiddos. And I think that's the other piece. If you're going to, let's say we've done all of that and now we're like, oh, something like you said, my gut is telling me something else is going on. It might be time for a more comprehensive evaluation. And you really do want to seek someone who understands the gifted brain.
Yeah, so let me talk a little, just briefly about that. Those complex cases may require a differential diagnosis. We really want to piece this apart and understand all the complexity associated with this. Is this simply gifted stuff that my child will work through? Is this something more than asynchrony, like ADHD or another neurodevelopmental issue or a learning challenge? We talked briefly about stealth dyslexia. So this is often, reading skills that look average, but really there's some challenges underlying that, where the gifted child is compensating with their intellect for otherwise relatively weak skills, and that doesn't really catch up to them until middle school or high school, and in some cases even college. So I think it's super important to go to somebody who really does understand gifted kids, and you're going to ask them to look at all of these different areas. Look at not just their intellect, but what's their motor development been like, gross and fine motor? What's their language development been like? Talk to me about their attention and executive function skills, and they can do a battery of tests, which sounds intimidating, but kids will often say, that was fun. Can I come back tomorrow?
Yeah.
And so I hope that you find, that type of an environment if you need it. Taking your child's sort of emotional pulse by looking at their social and emotional behavioral components. Is there some medical illness or underlying neurological or genetic issue Many kids with ADHD, for example, are diagnosed also with a sleep disorder or an undiagnosed sleep disorder. So we want to get that in hand before we're starting to go down a different path with them, for example. So I think we want to make that point for folks where we're really struggling to understand what's happening with this child.
Yeah, definitely. I think taking that approach where we're looking at that, again, this is the whole child, not just one area. We need to take a look at the whole child. So this is really important to us, I think, as professionals. When something is not going well with a kid, we see it as there's something that's being misunderstood or lost in translation.
This child isn't a bad kid.
Yeah.
They're not choosing to be this way. They're not lazy or unmotivated.
There's something else there, right? Is there an unmet need or unmet expectation? Is there something else going on? So we like to, again, get all the information, take the pieces of the puzzle, put them together, and then figure out what next steps can be and take a collaborative approach with parents as well, because this is why it's important. When you can understand what's going on with your child from a holistic perspective, you can change the lens through which you see their behavior. You're no longer going to see it through the lens of the story you're telling yourself about what's going on. You're going to see it, oh, this is just part of my kiddo's brain. And this is how they work. And think about the difference between they're lazy or unmotivated and, oh, this is how their brain works. They have ADHD. We're going to adjust this way. What is the difference in response? And I'll tell you, I didn't tell you about this, but I got an email a bit ago about from a family that I've worked with, and I'd given them a tool for their little kiddo who is gifted and had ADHD, and they were like, she never listens, what is going on? And I was like, hey, something simple, go over, touch their arm, touch their somewhere on their body, make eye contact, say a few words about what you'd like, have them repeat it back to you, and depart with affection, hug, squeeze, whatever. And they said they tried it, and they immediately jumped into their dad's arms with a big squeeze and a hug. And the mom said it was like she heard, it was like she was understood for the first time, because normally we're telling her something from across the room or we're saying it really loudly, right? And that tiny shift is a massive deposit in that emotional piggy bank that we carry around, right? And if we can change the lens through which we see our child's behavior, we can understand better, we can build that connection, we can shift in the home, and we can shift.
So as we wrap up today, we really just want to encourage you to be a part of this community, to seek and maintain connection with other folks who get it, other parents, or the school and community that you're a part of. Be an advocate. Be an advocate for your child. Be an advocate for your school. Be an advocate for education in our state, and for gifted education in particular. And, I hope you never stop learning. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. We appreciate you, and we are going to pause the recording at this point, and we'll take some questions from the audience. Thank you again for being with us.
So,
Hold on, wait,
One moment.
hold on a
I
minute.
just want to stop that recording. Be able to answer.
Oh, there we go.